Eleanor Washington slowly walked through the heavy glass doors of Premier National Bank on a busy Tuesday morning. The 68-year-old woman wore her best church dress, a simple navy blue outfit that she had owned for many years. Black shoes were old but polished to a shine, and she carried a worn leather purse that had seen better days. Despite her modest appearance, Eleanor carried herself with quiet dignity that came from a lifetime of hard work and raising her family. The bank was buzzing with the usual morning rush. Business people in expensive suits hurried past her, talking loudly on their phones about important deals and meetings. Young professionals tapped impatiently on their smartphones while waiting in line. The marble floors gleamed under the bright lights, and the high ceilings made every sound echo throughout the grand lobby. Eleanor had been coming to this bank for over 15 years, ever since she first moved to the city. Back then, the staff knew her by name and always greeted her with warm smiles. But those days seemed long gone now. New faces appeared behind the counters every few months, and the personal touch that once made banking feel friendly had disappeared. She joined the line at the teller counter, clutching her small Social Security check in her weathered hands. The monthly amount was not much, but it was enough to help her buy groceries and pay for her basic needs. Eleanor had worked as a school cafeteria worker for 30 years before retiring. She took pride in being independent and managing her own finances. The woman ahead of her finished her transaction and moved away from the counter. Eleanor stepped forward and smiled at the young teller, a woman in her 20s with perfectly styled hair and bright red lipstick. The teller barely looked up from her computer screen as Eleanor approached. "Good morning, dear," Eleanor said softly, placing her check on the counter. "I would like to deposit this check and withdraw $40 for my groceries, please." The teller glanced at the check with a bored expression. "I need to see your ID," she said in a flat tone, still not making eye contact with Eleanor. Eleanor nodded and began searching through her purse. Her hands shook slightly from arthritis, making it difficult to find what she was looking for among the various items in her bag. She had her reading glasses, a small wallet, some tissues, her house keys, and a few personal items that every grandmother carries. "I am sorry, dear," Eleanor said apologetically as she continued searching. "I know it is in here somewhere. Just give me a moment." The teller sighed loudly and tapped her long fingernails on the counter, making it clear that she was annoyed by the delay. Behind Eleanor, other customers began to shift impatiently in line. She could feel their eyes on her as she fumbled through her purse, and her cheeks began to flush with embarrassment. Finally, Eleanor found her driver's license tucked behind some old photographs of her grandchildren. She pulled it out with relief and handed it to the teller with a grateful smile. "Here it is." "Thank you for your patience," Eleanor said kindly. Despite the cold treatment she was receiving, the teller took the license and began typing information into her computer. She frowned as she looked at the screen, then back at the license, then at the screen again. Eleanor noticed the confused expression on the young woman's face and felt a small knot of worry forming in her stomach. "Is there a problem?" Eleanor asked gently. Before the teller could answer, a voice interrupted from behind them. "What seems to be the holdup here?" Eleanor turned to see a tall man in an expensive charcoal gray suit approaching the counter. His tie was perfectly knotted, his shoes were polished to perfection, and his hair was styled with just the right amount of gel. A gold watch gleamed on his wrist, and his cologne was so strong that Eleanor could smell it from several feet away. This was Richard Sterling, the bank manager, and everything about his appearance screamed success and importance. At 42 years old, he had worked his way up through the banking world by being ruthless, efficient, and completely focused on profits. He had little patience for customers who could not complete their transactions quickly and smoothly. Sterling looked at Eleanor with barely concealed irritation, saw an elderly woman in outdated clothes taking up valuable time at his busiest teller station. In his mind, she represented everything that was wrong with small account customers who required too much attention and brought in too little profit. "I am Richard Sterling, the bank manager," he announced loudly enough for everyone in the area to hear. "Is there some kind of problem with this transaction?" The teller looked relieved to have someone else handle the situation. "The address on her ID does not match what we have in our system," she explained. The license shows a different address than what is in her account information. Eleanor felt her heart sink. She had recently moved in with her son Marcus after her small apartment became too expensive to maintain on her fixed income. She had meant to update her address with the bank, but the process seemed complicated, and she had been putting it off. "Oh, I can explain that," Eleanor said quickly, her voice becoming slightly shaky. "I recently moved in with my son. I've been meaning to update my address, but I've not had the chance yet. I can bring the paperwork next week if that would help." Sterling barely listened to her explanation. He was already calculating how much time this was going to take and how it would affect his department's efficiency numbers. He had a reputation to maintain as someone who kept things running smoothly, and this elderly woman was threatening to disrupt his perfect record. "Ma'am, we cannot process transactions when there are discrepancies in the account information," Sterling said in a condescending tone. "This is basic banking policy. Should have taken care of this before coming in today." Eleanor felt the sting of his words but tried to remain polite. "I understand, sir. This is just a small deposit and withdrawal. I have been banking here for 15 years. Surely there must be something we can do." The people in line behind her were becoming increasingly impatient. Some were checking their watches, others were sighing loudly, and a few were making comments under their breath about how long this was taking. Eleanor could feel the weight of their frustration pressing down on her shoulders. Sterling looked around at the growing crowd and made a decision that would change everything. He was going to make an example of this situation, showing everyone that his bank ran efficiently and did not tolerate delays or complications. What happened next would set in motion a chain of events that nobody in that bank could have possibly imagined. Richard Sterling stepped closer to the counter and reached across the teller toward Eleanor. His movements were sharp and impatient, like a man who had more important things to do than deal with what he considered a minor inconvenience, without asking permission. He snatched Eleanor's driver's license from the young teller's hand. Eleanor was startled by his sudden action but said nothing. She had been raised to respect authority figures, and bank managers certainly fell into that category. She watched nervously as Sterling held her license up to the light, examining it as if it might be fake. "This address is completely different from what we have in our records," Sterling announced loudly, making sure everyone around could hear him. His voice carried across the marble lobby, causing heads to turn in their direction. "This identification is even legitimate?" Eleanor felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. The way Sterling was speaking made it sound like she was trying to commit some kind of fraud. She had never been accused of anything dishonest in her entire life, and the suggestion that she might be lying about her identity was deeply hurtful. "Sir, I can assure you that my identification is real," Eleanor said quietly, trying to keep her voice steady. "I have been a customer here for 15 years. I recently moved in with my son because my apartment rent became too expensive. Have updated my address sooner, but I have been dealing with some health issues, and it slipped my mind." Sterling barely listened to her explanation. He was too busy performing for the crowd that had gathered around them. In his mind, this was an opportunity to show everyone how efficiently and professionally he handled difficult situations. He wanted the other customers to see him as someone who maintained order and followed proper procedures. "Ma'am, I don't have time to listen to long stories about your personal problems," Sterling said dismissively. "Banking is about following rules and procedures. If you cannot provide proper identification that matches our records, then we cannot serve you. It's that simple." The teller behind the counter looked uncomfortable with how the situation was developing. She had seen Sterling handle difficult customers before, but something about the way he was treating this elderly woman seemed unnecessarily harsh. Other bank employees were starting to notice the commotion as well, and they exchanged worried glances with each other. Eleanor tried one more time to explain her situation. "Please, sir, I understand there is a problem with my address. But I have my Social Security card, my Medicare card, and even a utility bill for my son's house where I am staying. Would any of those help verify who I am?" She began reaching into her purse to find these additional documents, but Sterling waved his hand dismissively. He was becoming more irritated by the minute, and his patience had completely run out. "Look, lady, I don't care what other papers you have," Sterling said, his voice getting louder and more aggressive. "The bottom line is that your identification doesn't match our records. That means we cannot process your transaction. Period. End of discussion." Eleanor felt tears starting to form in her eyes. She had never been spoken to so rudely in a public place before. The way Sterling was treating her made her feel small and worthless, as if her decades of loyal customer service meant nothing at all. "I am sorry for the inconvenience," Eleanor said softly, her voice beginning to shake. "I will come back another day with the proper paperwork. I just needed to deposit my check and get money for groceries." But Sterling was not finished with his performance. He wanted to make absolutely sure that everyone in the bank understood who was in charge and how things were supposed to work. He held Eleanor's driver's license up in the air and shook it dramatically. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," Sterling announced to the crowd. "People come in here expecting us to bend the rules just because they have a sob story. Well, that's not how banking works. We have policies for a reason, and everyone has to follow them." The other customers watched in uncomfortable silence. Some of them felt bad for Eleanor, but nobody wanted to get involved in what seemed like an official bank matter. A few people even nodded in agreement with Sterling, thinking that he was just doing his job properly. Eleanor stood there quietly, waiting for Sterling to finish his speech and return her identification. She just wanted to leave the bank as quickly as possible and go home to avoid any further embarrassment. But Sterling had one more humiliating act planned. "I don't have time for this nonsense," Sterling said with obvious frustration. "We have real customers with legitimate business to take care of." With that, he carelessly tossed Eleanor's driver's license toward her. But instead of handing it back properly, he let it fall short, and the small plastic card hit the marble floor with a sharp clicking sound that echoed throughout the lobby. Eleanor stared down at her identification lying on the cold floor. Driver's license that represented her identity, her independence, and her dignity had just been thrown at her feet like a piece of garbage. The humiliation was complete and total. The entire bank fell silent. Even the customers who had been supporting Sterling's tough stance suddenly felt uncomfortable with what they had just witnessed. There was a big difference between following banking procedures and treating an elderly woman with such obvious disrespect. Eleanor looked around at all the faces staring at her. Some showed pity, others showed embarrassment, and a few showed anger at what they had just seen. But nobody moved to help her. Nobody said anything to defend her. She was completely alone in that moment of humiliation. With as much dignity as she could manage, Eleanor slowly bent down to pick up her driver's license. Her arthritic hands shook as she reached for it, and her knees protested as she lowered herself toward the floor. The simple act of retrieving her identification felt like the longest and most shameful moment of her entire life. Sterling watched with satisfaction as Eleanor picked up her license. In his mind, he had successfully handled a difficult situation and maintained the bank's professional standards. He had no idea that he had just made the biggest mistake of his career. As Eleanor straightened up, still holding her driver's license, she heard the heavy glass doors of the bank open behind her. Someone was entering the lobby, but she was too embarrassed to turn around and see who it was. What she didn't know was that her world was about to change completely. The heavy glass doors of Premier National Bank swung open with a whoosh of air that seemed to cut through the uncomfortable silence that had settled over the lobby. Eleanor was still bent over, her trembling fingers finally closing around her driver's license on the cold marble floor. The clicking sound of expensive dress shoes echoed across the bank as someone entered with confident, purposeful steps. Eleanor slowly straightened up, her knees aching from the effort and her face burning with shame. She clutched her driver's license tightly in her hand, wanting nothing more than to disappear from this place where she had been treated so badly. The tears that had been threatening to fall were now flowing freely down her cheeks, and she used her free hand to wipe them away as quietly as possible. Richard Sterling stood behind the counter with his arms crossed, looking satisfied with how he had handled what he considered a problem customer. He was already turning his attention to the next person in line, ready to move on from what he saw as a minor inconvenience in his busy day. The teller beside him looked uncomfortable but said nothing, afraid to challenge her manager's authority. The footsteps grew closer, and Eleanor could hear multiple voices approaching. It sounded like a group of people, probably more business customers coming to conduct their morning transactions. She wanted to leave before anyone else could see her in this embarrassing state, but she felt frozen in place by the humiliation she had just experienced. "Excuse me, is everything all right here?" A deep, familiar voice asked from behind her. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. She knew that voice better than any other voice in the world. It was warm, concerned, and filled with the kind of love that only a son could have for his mother. Slowly, she turned around to see Marcus Washington standing just a few feet away from her. Marcus was an impressive man at 45 years old. He stood tall and confident in a perfectly tailored charcoal gray business suit that probably cost more than most people earned in a month. His tie was silk, his shoes were Italian leather, and his watch was the kind that successful executives wore to important meetings. But despite his expensive appearance, his eyes were soft and filled with immediate concern when he saw his mother's distressed face. "Oh, Marcus," asked gently, his voice barely above a whisper. "What happened? Why are you crying?" Behind Marcus stood 3 other people, clearly his business associates. There was a woman in her 30s wearing a sharp business suit and carrying a leather briefcase. Next to her was an older man with gray hair and glasses, holding a folder full of important-looking documents. The third person was a younger man in his 20s. It's probably an assistant or junior executive, was looking around the bank with obvious appreciation for its impressive architecture. Eleanor felt a rush of embarrassment that her son had to see her in this state. She had always tried to be strong and independent, never wanting to burden him with her problems. The fact that he was witnessing her humiliation made everything feel 10 times worse. "Oh, Marcus," Eleanor said, her voice shaking, "I didn't expect to see you here. I was just trying to deposit my check, but there was a problem with my address, and I—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence without breaking down completely. Marcus immediately moved closer to his mother, his protective instincts kicking in. He could see that she was upset about something much more serious than a simple banking error. His mother was one of the strongest people he knew, and it took a lot to make her cry in public. "Mom, take your time," Marcus said softly, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Tell me exactly what happened here." From behind the counter, Richard Sterling watched this interaction with growing curiosity. He had assumed that the well-dressed man was just another customer who had stopped to help the elderly woman, which sometimes happened in situations like this. It was not uncommon for people to feel sorry for older customers who seemed confused or overwhelmed by banking procedures. Sterling decided to take control of the situation before it got out of hand. He had already spent too much time dealing with this one customer, and he needed to get his lobby back to normal operations. He walked around the counter and approached Marcus with his most professional smile. "I apologize for any disturbance," Sterling said in his smoothest customer service voice. "We had a minor issue with this customer's identification, but everything is resolved now. Is there something I can help you with today?" Marcus looked at Sterling with a calm but intense expression. There was something about the bank manager's tone that immediately put him on edge. He had heard that same condescending voice used on other people before, and he suspected it had just been used on his mother. "Yes," Marcus replied evenly. "I'm here for a scheduled appointment, but first I need to understand what happened to upset my mother so much." Sterling's smile faltered slightly when he heard the word mother. He looked back and forth between Marcus and Eleanor, trying to process this unexpected connection. The well-dressed businessman and the elderly woman in simple clothes seemed like they came from completely different worlds. "Your mother?" Sterling repeated, his voice showing the first hint of uncertainty. "Yes, my mother," Marcus confirmed, his arm now protectively around Eleanor's shoulders. "Eleanor Washington. And you are?" "I'm Richard Sterling, the bank manager," Sterling replied, his confidence beginning to waver. "I was just following standard banking procedures regarding identification verification." Eleanor looked up at her son with tears still in her eyes. She had hoped to avoid involving him in this embarrassing situation. But now that he was here, she felt a small measure of comfort. Marcus had always been her protector, even as a child, and she knew he would not let anyone treat her badly. "Mom, I need you to tell me everything that happened," Marcus said gently but firmly. "Don't leave out any details." Eleanor took a shaky breath and began to recount the events that had led to her humiliation. As she spoke, Marcus's expression grew darker and more serious. The three business associates behind him exchanged glances. Clearly sensing that something significant was happening, Sterling stood nearby,
listening to Eleanor's version of events with growing alarm. He was beginning to realize that this situation
might be more complicated than he had initially thought. The way Marcus was dressed and the way he carried himself suggested that he was not just any ordinary customer. As Eleanor finished her story, describing how her identification had been thrown on the floor, Marcus's jaw tightened. He looked down at the driver's license still clutched in his mother's hand, then back at Sterling with eyes that had turned ice cold. "So you threw my mother's ID on the floor?" Marcus asked quietly, his voice carrying a dangerous undertone that made Sterling's stomach drop. The lobby had gone completely silent again. Every customer and employee in the bank was now watching this confrontation, sensing that something much bigger than a simple banking dispute was about to unfold. The silence in the bank lobby was so complete that everyone could hear the soft hum of the air conditioning system. Richard Sterling felt sweat beginning to form on his forehead as he looked into Marcus Washington's cold, determined eyes. The bank manager had handled thousands of difficult situations during his career, but something about this moment felt different and dangerous. "I asked you a question," Marcus said, his voice remaining calm but carrying an unmistakable edge of authority. "Did you throw my mother's identification on the floor?" Sterling's mouth felt dry as he tried to find the right words. He could feel the eyes of every person in the bank watching him, waiting for his response. The three business associates behind Marcus were also staring at him with expressions of disbelief and disgust. "Well, Sterling began, then stopped. He looked around the lobby, hoping to find some support from his employees or customers. But everyone seemed to be waiting for him to explain his actions. "It was not intentional, sir. There was a misunderstanding about the address verification, and things got a bit heated." Marcus's expression did not change. "Things got heated," he repeated slowly. "So when things get heated, you throw elderly customers' identification cards on the floor?" Eleanor stood beside her son, still clutching her driver's license. She could feel the strength and protection radiating from Marcus. And for the first time since entering the bank, she felt safe. Her son had always been her champion, even as a young boy, and she knew he would not let this disrespect go unchallenged. "Marcus, please," Eleanor said quietly, touching his arm. "I just want to go home. I don't want to cause any more trouble." Marcus looked down at his mother with tender eyes. "Mom, you didn't cause any trouble. You came here to conduct normal banking business, and you were treated with complete disrespect. That's not your fault." He turned his attention back to Sterling, who was shifting uncomfortably from foot to foot. "I want to hear exactly what happened, step by step, right? And I want to hear it from you." Sterling cleared his throat and tried to regain some of his earlier confidence. "Sir, I understand you're upset, but we have procedures that all customers must follow. When there are discrepancies in account information, we cannot process transactions. It's bank policy," Marcus repeated. "Does bank policy include speaking rudely to customers? Does it include throwing their identification on the ground?" The woman in the business suit behind Marcus stepped forward slightly. She was Sarah Chen, Marcus's chief financial officer, and she had been working with him for over 5 years. She had seen him handle difficult negotiations and challenging business situations, but she had never seen him this controlled and focused anger before. "Mr. Washington," Sarah said quietly, "perhaps we should discuss this privately with the bank president." Marcus held up his hand without taking his eyes off Sterling. "No, Sarah. I want this handled right here, right now, in front of everyone who witnessed my mother's humiliation." Sterling was beginning to understand that this was not going to be resolved as easily as he had hoped. The man standing in front of him was clearly someone important. Someone who was used to being treated with respect and getting answers to his questions. "Look, Mr. Washington," Sterling said, trying a different approach. "I apologize if your mother felt disrespected. That was certainly not my intention. Banking can be stressful, and sometimes things don't go as smoothly as we would like. But I assure you, I was just following proper procedures." Marcus took a step closer to Sterling. Following proper procedures, he said, "Let me ask you something. Mr. Sterling, do your proper procedures include making announcements to the entire lobby about a customer's personal business? Do they include questioning the legitimacy of someone's identification in front of a crowd of strangers?" Sterling felt his face getting red. "Well, no, but do your proper procedures include making an elderly woman bend down to pick up her identification from the floor while everyone watches?" "That was an accident," Sterling protested weakly. "An accident," Marcus repeated. "You accidentally threw my mother's ID on the floor." The older man with gray hair behind Marcus was Dr. Robert Mitchell, the head of legal affairs for Washington Industries. He had been listening to this conversation with growing interest and concern. He knew Marcus well enough to recognize when his boss was building toward something significant. Eleanor looked up at her son and saw something in his expression that made her heart skip. She had seen that look before, usually when Marcus was about to make an important business decision or when he was preparing to stand up for something he believed in strongly. "Marcus," Eleanor said softly, "what are you thinking?" Marcus looked down at his mother and smiled for the first time since entering the bank. "I'm thinking that Mr. Sterling and everyone else in this bank need to understand exactly who they just disrespected." He turned back to Sterling and the crowd of onlookers. "My name is Marcus Washington. I am the founder and CEO of Washington Industries." A murmur ran through the crowd. Several people immediately recognized the name. Washington Industries was one of the largest and most successful companies in the city, known for its innovative technology solutions and massive government contracts. Of business magazines, numerous times, Sterling's face went completely pale. He knew exactly who Marcus Washington was. Every banker in the city knew about Washington Industries and its brilliant young CEO. The company had been growing rapidly for the past decade, and Marcus Washington was considered one of the most influential business leaders in the region. "And this woman," Marcus continued, placing his arm around Eleanor's shoulders, "is my mother, Eleanor Washington, which raised me as a single parent, worked 2 jobs to put me through college, and taught me everything I know about treating people with dignity and respect." The crowd was now completely silent and focused on Marcus's words. Even the bank employees behind the counter had stopped what they were doing to listen. "My mother came to your bank today to deposit her small Social Security check and withdraw money for groceries," Marcus said, his voice growing stronger. "She has been a loyal customer here for 15 years, and your response was to humiliate her in front of everyone, question her honesty, and throw her identification on the floor like garbage." Sterling opened his mouth to speak, but Marcus held up his hand. "I'm not finished," Marcus said firmly. "You see, Mr. Sterling, I didn't just come here today to visit my mother. I came here for a very important business meeting, a meeting that could have changed the future of this bank." The blood drained from Sterling's face as he began to understand the implications of what Marcus was saying. Behind the counter, other bank employees were exchanging worried glances as they too began to grasp the magnitude of the situation. "What kind of meeting?" Sterling asked in a voice barely above a whisper. Marcus smiled, but it was not a friendly smile. "It's a kind of meeting that involves $5 billion. The words $5 billion hung in the air like a thunderclap. Richard Sterling felt his knees go weak as the full meaning of what Marcus had just said began to sink in. Around the lobby, customers and employees alike stood frozen, trying to process what they had just heard. Sterling's mind raced as he tried to remember. If there were any major business meetings scheduled for that day, then it hit him like a punch to the stomach. He suddenly remembered the memo that had been circulating through the bank's executive offices for weeks. Washington Industries was considering a massive expansion project that would require unprecedented financing, and Premier National Bank was one of 3 institutions competing for the contract. $5 billion, Sterling repeated in a whisper, his voice cracking slightly. Marcus nodded slowly, watching Sterling's face carefully. "That's right, Mr. Sterling. Washington Industries is expanding our operations nationwide. We need a banking partner who can handle our payroll services, our investment accounts, our loan requirements, And are international transactions. We're talking about the largest commercial banking contract in this city's history. Sarah Chin, Marcus's chief financial officer, stepped forward with her briefcase. "We've been evaluating 3 different banks for the past 6 months," she said. In a professional tone, Premier National was actually our first choice based on your reputation for customer service and your established commercial banking division. Sterling. The words "was our first choice" hit him like a physical blow. He could already see his career crashing down around him. And worse yet, he knew that his actions had potentially cost his entire bank the deal of a lifetime. Dr. Mitchell, the legal affairs director, consulted his watch. "We're supposed to meet with Bank President Jonathan Hayes in about 10 minutes, he said quietly to Marcus. "Should I call and cancel the appointment?" Marcus looked down at his mother, who was still holding her driver's license and looking overwhelmed by everything that was happening around her. Eleanor had never imagined that her simple trip to the bank would lead to such a dramatic confrontation. "No, Robert," Marcus said firmly. "We're going to keep that appointment. But first, I want to make sure my mother's banking needs are taken care of properly." He turned to the young teller who had been serving Eleanor before Sterling intervened. The woman looked terrified, clearly understanding that she was witnessing something that could affect everyone's job security. "Miss," Marcus said gently, "I would like you to help my mother deposit her check and make her withdrawal. Can you do that for me?" The teller nodded quickly and gestured for Eleanor to come back to the counter. "Yes, sir, of course. Right away."
Eleanor
Looked up at Marcus with uncertainty. "Are you sure, son? I don't want to cause any more problems." Marcus squeezed his mother's shoulder reassuringly. "Mom, you're not causing problems. You're a customer who deserves to be treated with respect. Go ahead and take care of your business." As Eleanor approached the counter, teller treated her with the kind of careful attention usually reserved for the bank's most important clients. The young woman processed the deposit quickly and efficiently, counted out $40 in cash, and handed everything to Eleanor with a respectful smile. "Thank you for your business, Mrs. Washington," the teller said sincerely. "Is there anything else I can help you with today?" Eleanor shook her head and returned to Marcus's side. She was still processing everything that had happened, but she felt grateful that her son had been there to protect her when she needed it most. Meanwhile, Sterling was desperately trying to think of a way to salvage the situation. He could see his career, his reputation, and his bank's future slipping away because of his terrible decision to humiliate an elderly woman over a simple address discrepancy. "Mr. Washington," Sterling said, his voice shaking slightly, "I want to apologize sincerely for what happened here today. Your mother is clearly a valued customer, and she should have been treated with the respect she deserves." Marcus looked at Sterling with cold eyes. "Sterling, do you know what my mother taught me when I was growing up?" Sterling shook his head, afraid to speak. "She taught me that the way you treat people when you think they don't matter shows who you really are," Marcus said slowly. "You looked at my mother and saw someone you thought was unimportant, someone whose feelings didn't matter, someone who could be humiliated in public without consequences." The lobby was completely silent as Marcus continued. "But here's what you didn't understand, Mr. Sterling. Every person who walks through those doors matters. Every customer deserves to be treated with dignity. Whether they're depositing $1 million or just trying to get money for groceries." Sterling's hands were shaking now. He knew that Marcus was right, and he knew that his behavior had been inexcusable. But more than that, he knew that he had cost his bank the biggest opportunity in its history. "Sir, please," Sterling said desperately. "I know I made a terrible mistake, but surely we can work something out. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make this right." Marcus shook his head. "Mr. Sterling, this isn't about you anymore. It's about what kind of institution Premier National Bank really is. But does your bank stand behind managers who treat customers this way? Does your leadership approve of the kind of behavior I witnessed here today?" At that moment, the elevator doors at the far end of the lobby opened, and a distinguished-looking man in his 60s walked out. He was tall and silver-haired, wearing an expensive suit that marked him as a senior executive. This was Jonathan Hayes, the president of Premier National Bank. Hayes had been expecting Marcus Washington and his team for their crucial meeting. But when they didn't arrive at his office at the scheduled time, he had come down to the lobby to see if there was a problem. What he found was a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his career. "Mr. Washington," Hayes said, approaching with a concerned expression, "I was expecting you upstairs. Is everything all right?" Marcus looked at the bank president with a mixture of disappointment and resolve. "Mr. Hayes, I'm afraid we have a serious problem. Your bank manager just provided me with a very clear demonstration of how Premier National Bank treats its customers." Hayes looked confused, glancing between Marcus and Sterling. "I'm sorry, I don't understand. What kind of demonstration?" "The kind that shows me exactly what kind of business partner you would be," Marcus replied. "Mr. Hayes, I'd like you to meet my mother, Eleanor Washington. She's been a loyal customer of this bank for 15 years. Today, your manager threw her identification on the floor and humiliated her in front of everyone in this lobby." Hayes's face went white as he began to understand the catastrophic situation that had developed. He looked at Sterling, who was now visibly sweating and shaking. "Richard, please tell me this isn't true," Hayes said in a voice filled with dread. Sterling opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He knew that anything he said now would only make things worse. His career at Premier National Bank was over, and he had taken the bank's biggest opportunity down with him. Marcus adjusted his tie and looked at his watch. "Mr. Hayes, I think our meeting has been very educational, but I don't believe we have anything more to discuss." Bank President Jonathan Hayes stood in the marble lobby of his own institution, watching the biggest business opportunity in the bank's history walk away because of one man's terrible decision. His face was pale, and his hands were trembling, slightly as he processed what Marcus Washington had just told him. "Mr. Washington, please," Hayes said urgently. "Let me speak with you privately. I'm sure we can resolve this misunderstanding." Marcus looked at Hayes with a mixture of disappointment and finality. "Mr. Hayes, there's no misunderstanding here. Your bank manager treated my mother with complete disrespect and humiliation. Tells me everything I need to know about the culture of this institution." Hayes turned to Sterling with fury in his eyes. "Richard, is this true? Did you throw Mrs. Washington's identification on the floor?" Sterling's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. The entire lobby was watching him, waiting for his response. He knew that lying would only make things worse, but admitting the truth would seal his fate. "It wasn't intentional," Sterling said weakly. "There was a problem with the address verification and things got complicated. I may have been a bit impatient, but I never meant to disrespect anyone." Eleanor, who had been quietly listening to the conversation, stepped forward. Despite everything that had happened, she felt uncomfortable with the attention and conflict her situation had created. "Marcus," Eleanor said softly, "maybe we should just go home. I have my money now, and I don't want to cause any more trouble." For these people, Marcus looked down at his mother with love and admiration. Even after being humiliated and disrespected, she was still thinking about others and trying to avoid conflict. This was exactly the kind of character and strength that had shaped him into the man he had become. "Mom, you're not causing trouble," Marcus said gently. "You're standing up for yourself and for every other customer who might be treated this way in the future. That's important." He turned back to Hayes. "Mr. Hayes, my mother has been banking here for 15 years. She's never missed a payment, never caused any problems, and has always been a model customer. Today, she came in to deposit her Social Security check and withdraw $40 for groceries. That's all. Your manager decided to make a spectacle of her because of a simple address change?" Hayes nodded frantically. "I understand completely, Mr. Washington. This is absolutely unacceptable behavior. I assure you that Mr. Sterling will face immediate consequences for his actions." Marcus shook his head. "Mr. Hayes, this isn't about punishing one employee. This is about the kind of institution you're running. How many other customers have been treated this way? How many other elderly people have been humiliated in your lobby while everyone just watched?" Sarah Chen stepped forward and opened her briefcase. "Mr. Hayes, we've been evaluating banks for 6 months. We've looked at their financial stability, their commercial banking capabilities, and their customer service records. But most importantly, we've been looking for a partner who shares our values." Dr. Mitchell nodded in agreement. "Washington Industries has built its reputation on treating people with dignity and respect. We simply cannot do business with an institution that doesn't." Share those fundamental principles. Hayes felt desperate. He knew that losing the Washington Industries contract would be devastating for his bank. The $5 billion deal would have secured Premier National's position as the leading commercial bank in the city. More than that, it would have meant jobs, growth, and prosperity for all of his employees. Mr. Washington, please give me a chance to make this right, Hayes pleaded.
Oh.
I'll fire Mr. Sterling immediately. I'll implement new customer service training programs. I'll do whatever it takes to earn back your trust. Marcus looked at Hayes with a sad expression. Mr. Hayes, the damage is already done. My mother was humiliated in front of all these people. Her dignity was trampled on by someone who thought she didn't matter. You can't undo that. He gestured toward the crowd of customers and employees who were still watching the confrontation. Everyone in this lobby witnessed what happened. They saw how your bank treats people who don't look important or wealthy. That's not the kind of partner we want for our business. Sterling finally found his voice. Mr. Washington, I'm begging you. I made a terrible mistake, was having a bad day, and I let my frustration get the better of me. Please don't punish the entire bank for my actions. Marcus looked at Sterling with cold eyes. Mr. Sterling, you weren't having a bad day. You were showing your true character. You saw an elderly woman in simple clothes, and you decided she was beneath your respect? That's not a mistake. It's a choice. Eleanor tugged gently on Marcus's sleeve. Son, I think we should go now. I'm tired, and I just want to go home. Marcus nodded and put his arm around his mother's shoulders. You're right, Mom. We have better things to do with our time. He looked at Hayes one last time. Mr. Hayes, Premier National Bank is no longer being considered for the Washington Industries contract. We'll be taking our business to City First Bank, where we've been treated with professionalism and respect. Hayes felt his heart sink. City First Bank was Premier National's biggest competitor, and landing the Washington Industries contract would give them a huge advantage in the market. Furthermore, Marcus continued, I'll be moving all of my existing personal accounts to City First as well. And I'll be recommending that all of my employees and business associates do the same. The impact of Marcus's words hit Hayes like a physical blow. Washington Industries employed over 3,000 people in the city. If even a fraction of them moved their accounts, it would be a significant loss for Premier National, as Marcus and Eleanor walked toward the bank's exit. The entire lobby remained silent. Customers and employees alike watched them go. Understanding that they had just witnessed something that would be talked about for years to come, Sterling slumped against the counter. Knowing that his career in banking was over, he stood frozen. Calculating the millions of dollars in lost business and the damage to his bank's reputation, outside the bank, Marcus helped his mother into his car. Eleanor was quiet for a moment, then looked at her son with pride and gratitude. Thank you for standing up for me, Eleanor said softly. I know that was a big decision for you. Marcus started the car and smiled at his mother. Mom, you raised me to believe that how we treat people matters more than money or business deals. Today I got to put that lesson into practice. They drove away from Premier National Bank. Eleanor felt a sense of dignity restored. She had been humiliated, but she had also been defended by someone who loved her. More importantly, she had seen her son choose principle over profit, just as she had taught him to do. Within hours, news of the incident spread throughout the business community. Premier National Bank's stock price dropped, and several other major clients began questioning their relationship with the institution. Richard Sterling was fired that same day, and his reputation in the banking industry was destroyed. Meanwhile, City First Bank welcomed Washington Industries with open arms, and the $5 billion deal was signed within a week. The partnership proved to be incredibly successful, leading to even more business and growth for both organizations. Eleanor Washington continued to bank at City First, where she was always treated with the respect and dignity she deserved. Marcus Washington continued to build his business empire on the foundation of values his mother had taught him, proving that treating people right was not just good morals but also good business.